What if the Allies had lost? What if Nazi Germany didn't fall in 1945, but triumphed? Imagine waking up in a world where Berlin, not Washington, not Moscow, is the heart of global power. Where democracy never recovered, where resistance was crushed, and where tyranny wrote the rules of the 20th century. A terrifying question, yet not impossible. Because history, as we'll see, didn't bend toward freedom by destiny. It turned that way by chance, by human error, and by the courage of those who refused to give in. So tonight, we step into an alternate timeline, an AI reimagined world documentary. A chilling vision of what our world might have been if the Nazis had won World War II. The moment of divergence, where history splits. History is fragile. We like to think the Allies were always destined to win. But victory was never guaranteed. Think of it. In 1940, almost all of Europe was already under Hitler's boot. France had collapsed in 6 weeks. Poland was gone. Denmark and Norway surrendered almost overnight. Britain stood alone, battered by bombs, clinging to survival by the thinnest of threads. Every moment of the war was a knife's edge. At Dunkirk, if Hitler hadn't hesitated, hundreds of thousands of British soldiers could have been annihilated. If the Luftwaffe had crippled Britain's radar stations, the Royal Air Force may have been swept from the skies. If Operation Barbarossa had moved just a month earlier, the Soviets might never have recovered. If Japan had focused its energy on cutting off Soviet oil instead of attacking Pearl Harbor, America might have stayed out of Europe longer. Any one of these shifts could have altered the war. And in our alternate timeline, several do. This is the butterfly effect of history, where one flap of wings in 1940 creates an empire dominating 2025. The Nazi war machine unstoppable. To understand how this alternate world unfolds, we must grasp the terror of Germany's military machine. In our timeline, the Wehrmacht shocked the world with blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tank divisions, mechanized infantry, and dive bombers worked in harmony, overwhelming nations before they could react. France, thought to be one of the strongest armies on earth, fell in 6 weeks. Paris, the city of light, was darkened under swastikas almost overnight. Now imagine this momentum never slowed. In this timeline, Germany avoids the blunders of overconfidence. Logistics are prioritized. Supplies are properly stocked. Hitler's reckless interference is minimized. His generals, Rommel, Guderian, Manstein, are allowed to execute strategies without being second-guessed. The result? The Nazi war machine doesn't just dominate continental Europe. It becomes unstoppable. And Europe itself begins to transform under its iron grip. Europe under the swastika. Europe in the 1940s was not just territory. It was culture, identity, and the soul of the Western world. Now imagine it rewritten under Nazi rule. Paris, stripped of its art, its spirit, reduced to a provincial capital. The Louvre emptied, its treasures shipped to Berlin. Rome, no longer center of Catholic faith, but a satellite of fascist power. Warsaw, Prague, Amsterdam, Oslo, all bound under a new order that promised 1,000 years of dominance. The Nazi plan for Europe, called the General Plan Ost, envisioned nothing less than ethnic cleansing on a continental scale. Slavic populations would be displaced, enslaved, or exterminated. German settlers would flood eastward, building new cities on the ashes of old. It would not be Europe as we know it. It would be a German colony from the Atlantic to the Urals. And at the heart of it, Britain, the stubborn island nation that, in our world, refused to fall. But in this alternate reality, Britain is next. Britain falls. Operation Sea Lion success in 1940. Hitler drew up plans for an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. In our history, the Luftwaffe failed to gain control of the skies. Britain's radar, its courageous pilots, and sheer resilience turned the tide in the Battle of Britain. But in this alternate world, events take a darker turn. Picture this: the Luftwaffe overwhelms Britain's radar towers, knocking out the early warning system. The RAF, unable to scramble effectively, bleeds to death in the skies. London burns under relentless firebombing. Then, in September 1940, German paratroopers descend on Dover. Barges packed with Wehrmacht troops cross the channel under cover of air superiority. British defenses crumble. The Royal Navy, stretched thin and plagued by U-boat attacks, fails to repel the invasion. Within weeks, German tanks roll into London. Winston Churchill is captured, perhaps executed, perhaps paraded in Berlin as a warning to others. The Union Jack is lowered. The swastika rises over Buckingham Palace. Britain, the last great holdout, falls. And with its fall, the consequences ripple across the globe. America loses its closest ally in Europe. Resistance movements in France, Norway, and the Low Countries are starved of support. German U-boats, now operating from British ports, strangle the Atlantic shipping lanes. The Atlantic itself becomes a Nazi ocean. And Hitler, triumphant, turns his gaze eastward, toward his greatest obsession. The next prize, the Soviet Union for Hitler, Britain was a distraction. The true target was always the Soviet Union. In our world, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, was launched in June 1941. First, it was devastating. Millions of Soviet troops were captured. But the vast distances, the brutal winters, and Soviet resilience eventually stopped the Germans cold outside Moscow. But in this alternate timeline, events are different. Because Britain has already fallen, Germany can commit its full strength eastward. No need to split resources. No second front. The invasion comes earlier, perhaps in May 1941, before the mud and before the snows. Logistics are improved. Supplies flow more smoothly. Hitler listens to his generals, striking Moscow directly instead of diverting forces to Ukraine. Moscow falls by the end of 1941. Stalin disappears, whether killed, captured, or driven into exile. The Red Army, decapitated, collapses in chaos. Without a Soviet Union, there is no Eastern Front to drain Germany's strength. No Stalingrad. No Kursk. No grinding war of attrition. The Reich now stretches from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. And the world has never seen such a colossus. The Soviet Union's collapse June 22, 1941. In our timeline, Operation Barbarossa unleashed the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and planes, poured across the Soviet border. It was the clash of titans, Nazi fascism versus Soviet communism. In our world, the Soviets endured. They bled, they retreated, they froze the invaders in the snows outside Moscow. But in this alternate timeline, the outcome is brutally different. Because with Britain already conquered, Germany no longer needs to divert resources west. The entire might of the Wehrmacht descends on the east. Supplies are ready. Fuel is secured. Winter clothing is prepared. Most importantly, Hitler listens to his generals. Instead of splitting his forces, one army for Moscow, one for Ukraine, one for Leningrad, he drives directly for the Soviet heart. Moscow falls before winter. Stalin, whether assassinated, captured, or exiled, vanishes from the stage. Without his iron hand, the Soviet Union fractures. The Red Army, cut off from leadership, collapses into disarray. Millions surrender. Entire regions are abandoned. By 1942, German banners fly over Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. And in this alternate history, there is no turning tide in the East. Without the Soviet Union, the Allies lose their greatest land force. And Germany gains the richest prize imaginable, the Soviet Union's vast resources. Grain from Ukraine feeds the Reich. Oil from the Caucasus fuels tanks, planes, and ships. Siberian metals supply weapons factories. Hitler's dream of Lebensraum, living space for Germans, becomes reality. Slavic populations are enslaved or exterminated. German settlers move eastward, founding New Berlin and New Hamburg on conquered soil. By 1943, the Reich rules an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains. An empire without rival in human history. Japan and the Axis world order, but Germany is not alone. On the other side of the world, Japan watches its allies' success with hungry eyes. In our history, Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, drawing America into the war. That decision sealed its fate. But in this alternate timeline, Japan chooses differently. Instead of waking the American giant, Tokyo coordinates closely with Berlin. With the Soviets collapsing, Japan strikes north, seizing Siberia. The Trans-Siberian Railway falls into Japanese hands. Vladivostok becomes a Japanese port. At the same time, Japanese forces surge through China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. With Britain gone, colonies in Burma, Malaya, and India are easy prey. The Royal Navy, once a global power, lies shattered. By 1943, the Axis has created a world order that seems unshakable. Germany controls Europe and Western Russia. Japan dominates East Asia and the Pacific. Italy, though weaker, rules North Africa and the Mediterranean. The three powers divide the globe like predators sharing a feast. The question now is simple. Where does America stand? Life inside the Reich, society, culture, and oppression. To imagine this new world, we must step inside the Reich itself. For loyal Germans, life seems prosperous. Cities are rebuilt with monumental architecture. Massive stone buildings, vast highways, stadiums for rallies that dwarf the Roman Colosseum. Propaganda blares from radios and cinema screens, painting the Reich as a utopia of order and strength. Children wear uniforms from the age of 6, chanting oaths of loyalty to Hitler. The education system molds minds not for freedom, but for obedience. But peel back the surface, and the reality is horror. The Holocaust in our world claimed 6 million Jewish lives. In this alternate timeline, without Allied victory, it does not end in 1945. It escalates. The final solution expands across the continent. Jews, Roma, disabled people, and political dissidents are hunted relentlessly. Entire nations are targeted for erasure. In Eastern Europe, Slavic populations are deported, starved, or exterminated. By the 1950s, millions more vanish in death camps scattered across the Reich's empire. Culture suffers too. Books deemed degenerate are banned. Modern art is outlawed. Jazz, swing, and any music tied to Black or Jewish culture is silenced. Scientific progress bends only toward military and ideological ends. The world becomes efficient, yes, but cold, gray, and dehumanized. It is the triumph of control over creativity. The fate of the United States. Now we arrive at the burning question. What happens to America? In our real history, the U.S. entered the war after Pearl Harbor and became the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, planes, and ships on a scale Hitler could never match. American soldiers stormed Normandy, liberated Europe, and reshaped the world. But in this alternate reality, things unfold differently. Without Pearl Harbor, America hesitates. Congress remains divided. The public, still scarred by World War I, resists another foreign war. Roosevelt cannot justify intervention when Britain has already fallen and the Soviet Union is collapsing. Instead, the U.S. turns inward. It focuses on defending the Western Hemisphere, wary of U-boats patrolling the Atlantic and Japanese fleets dominating the Pacific. By the mid-1940s, the world is divided into two spheres: the Old World, ruled by the Axis; the New World, led by the United States. But America is no longer the confident superpower we know. It is isolated, anxious, watching a hostile globe. Trade routes collapse. Latin America wavers under Nazi propaganda and infiltration. And worst of all, the Axis begins to advance technologically. The New World map, a global Reich. Step back and picture the globe by 1945 in this alternate reality. Europe, a fortress under Nazi control. Russia, stripped of sovereignty, broken into German provinces. Africa, divided into colonies exploited for resources. Asia, under Japanese domination from India to the Pacific. The Americas, alone, holding out against the tide. The dream of Hitler's thousand-year Reich seems to be real. But this new world is unstable. Because beneath the surface of victory, seeds of resistance are already stirring. And while America hesitates, whispers of rebellion echo across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Secret networks, underground movements, ordinary people refusing to bow. The question is not just whether the Reich can win, but whether it can last. Resistance and underground movements' victory doesn't mean peace. Even in this nightmare timeline, not everyone bows to the Reich. Across Europe, resistance flickers like hidden embers. In France, the Maquis still sabotage railroads. In Poland, secret schools teach forbidden history. In Germany itself, whispers of conspiracy spread. Officers who despise Hitler, priests who refuse to bend, students who hand out leaflets in the dead of night. But the cost is staggering. In occupied Britain, every act of defiance risks not just execution, but the extermination of entire families. Villages are burned for hiding partisans. The Gestapo hunts rebels with ruthless efficiency. Fear is everywhere. And yet resistance grows. Why? Because tyranny always breeds rebellion. Because humans, when pushed, refuse to surrender their dignity. Imagine a young girl in Paris smuggling messages under loaves of bread. A Polish engineer secretly redirecting German blueprints to American contacts. A Soviet partisan, half-starved, sabotaging trains deep in the forests. They cannot topple the Reich outright, but they slow it. They bleed it. They keep alive the possibility that one day, the Colossus may stumble. Resistance becomes the ghost haunting Hitler's empire. The Cold War that never was, or a new one emerges. In our timeline, the Cold War defined the second half of the 20th century. The US and the Soviet Union locked in ideological and nuclear standoff. But in this alternate world, the Soviet Union is gone. No Iron Curtain. No Soviet tanks in Berlin. No Kremlin versus White House. Instead, a new global duel begins. America versus the Reich. Two superpowers. Two futures. The United States, still democratic, but increasingly paranoid, building walls and fleets to protect itself. Nazi Germany, vast, resource-rich, ideologically driven, determined to break America's will. This becomes the Cold War of the alternate 20th century. Instead of NATO, imagine underground resistance networks secretly supplied by America. Instead of Berlin divided by a wall, picture New York bracing for missile strikes from German submarines. And the space race? Not Washington versus Moscow, but Washington versus Berlin. Who builds the first satellite? Who puts the first man on the moon? Who controls the skies above Earth? In this world, the Reich invests heavily in rockets, inspired by Wernher von Braun. But instead of defecting to America, von Braun remains loyal or loyal enough to serve Berlin. His rockets, perfected earlier, are capable not only of crossing continents but of carrying nuclear warheads. It's not just a Cold War. It's a colder, darker one. A struggle where the stakes are not influence or ideology alone, but survival itself. The human cost, what humanity loses. But let's step back and ask. Beyond battles and politics, what does humanity lose in this alternate history? Because a Nazi victory doesn't just mean new borders. It means erased futures. The Holocaust in this world continues unchecked. 6 million dead in our reality becomes tens of millions. Entire Jewish communities vanish. Roma are eradicated. Slavic nations shrink under waves of deportation and famine. And with those people lost, so too are their contributions to humanity. Think of Albert Einstein. In our world, he fled Nazi Germany and revolutionized science. In this world, he never escapes. His theories may be buried, his voice silenced. Think of Hannah Arendt, whose writings shaped political thought. Gone. Think of countless musicians, artists, scientists, doctors, people whose ideas changed the modern world. Erased before they could blossom. Civil rights movements? Gone. Feminist waves? Crushed under patriarchal authoritarianism. Decolonization? delayed for decades, perhaps never truly realized. The very concept of human rights, born in response to Nazi crimes, never emerges. No universal declaration, no Geneva Conventions, no global recognition of dignity. The 20th century becomes not a story of liberation and progress, but of stagnation and fear. The 21st century in a Nazi world. Now imagine our present day 2025, in that alternate reality. Europe, dominated by the Reich, is a cold monument to authoritarianism. Berlin, redesigned into Hitler's dream of Germania. Towers with marble buildings, massive highways, and statues meant to intimidate, not inspire. Africa is stripped of resources, its people enslaved under colonial rule. Asia remains divided between German and Japanese spheres, with India, China, and Southeast Asia exploited for labor and wealth. The world is divided into three blocks: the Reich Bloc, Europe, Africa, Western Russia; the Japanese Bloc, East Asia and the Pacific; the American Bloc, North and South America, isolated but defiant. Technology advances, but under tyranny. Rockets, nuclear bombs, and jet aircraft exist, but freedom of expression, art, or open science does not. The Internet, if it emerges at all, is tightly controlled, a surveillance tool rather than a platform of connection. Ordinary life? Gray, restricted. Families whisper behind closed doors. Education is pure indoctrination. Every move is monitored by the state. And yet, even in this world, resistance lingers. Underground groups hide in digital shadows. Secret networks trade forbidden books, banned music, lost histories. Hope refuses to die. But humanity's potential is crippled. Instead of space exploration uniting nations, it becomes a race for orbital weapons. Instead of global cooperation on climate change, the Reich ignores it or exploits it. Instead of celebrating diversity, the world is chained by enforced uniformity. This is the 21st century under Nazi victory. Advanced yet broken. Powerful yet empty. Closing reflection. Why history turned out differently, and here is the chilling truth. This nightmare world was possible. Victory was not guaranteed for the Allies. The outcome hinged on thin margins: radar at Dover, snow in Moscow, Japanese choices in 1941, American willpower in 1942. The Allies prevailed because ordinary people resisted tyranny. Because soldiers bled on beaches from Normandy to Iwo Jima. Because scientists, engineers, and workers built weapons faster than the Axis could. And yes, because Hitler himself made fatal mistakes, driven by arrogance, hatred, and delusion. Our world today exists not by fate, but by fragile chance and by courage. Call to action, remembering the real lessons. So the question isn't only, what if Germany won World War II? The question is, what if we forget how close they came? Because ideologies of hate never disappear. They wait in shadows for complacency. This alternate history isn't just speculation. It's a warning. A reminder that freedom is never free, that every generation must defend it. If you've stayed with us through this journey, ask yourself, what would you have done in that world? And what will you do now, in ours, to protect what was so desperately won? The music swells. The globe spins once more, but this time it glows with light, not shadow. History could have turned differently, but it didn't. And that is why we must never forget.